Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Utah Division of State History's Women's History Month speaker event. My name is Catherine Kitterman, and I'm the coordinator for the Women's History Initiative at the division. And this year's theme, the national theme for National Women's History Month, is celebrating women who tell our stories. And we are really lucky today to learn about a Utah woman who exemplifies that theme in every way. Mae Timbimboo Parry was a historian, a matriarch, a storyteller, and a memory keeper for the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. We acknowledge that this land called Utah, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional, ancestral, and current homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, Ute, and Navajo peoples. Today's speaker is Darren Parry, Mae Timbimboo Parry's grandson, and I'm going to introduce him quickly before I turn the time over to him. Darren Parry is the former chairman of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. He serves on the Utah Humanities and PBS Utah Board of Directors, and he attended the University of Utah and Weber State University, receiving his bachelor's degree in secondary education. Darren is the author of The Bear River Massacre, A Shoshone History, and he teaches Native American history at Utah State University. He lectures around the country on Native American issues surrounding history and Indigenous views related to sustainability. And he recently gave a lecture at the University of Copenhagen. He spoke about Indigenous views to climate and environment. Darren is currently a practitioner in residence at the University of Utah Environmental Humanities Program. His passions in life, he says, are his wife, Melody, 7 children, and 17 grandchildren. His other passion is his tribal family. He wants to make sure that those who have gone before him are not forgotten. And Darren left just a few things out of his bio, including the fact that he's a former candidate for US Congress, as well as an honorary life member of the Utah State Historical Society. He and Mae Timbimboo Parry received that award last fall. I first heard Darren speak about his grandmother nearly 5 years ago, and I haven't forgotten the impact her story had on me as a historian. Darren, we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to share about Mae's work and her continuing legacy. As we get ready to hear from Darren, sorry, I'll just say one thing here on the housekeeping. This talk is being recorded, so we will keep your mics muted due to the size of the group, but we do want to hear your questions. So Darren will be leaving time for Q&A after he speaks. So please add your questions to the chat, and then we will address as many as we can. And now, Darren, take it away.
Well, thank you. Thanks for giving my grandmother a voice. I never turned down an opportunity to talk about a woman that has shaped my life so much. And so I feel honored to be here today. I want to share her story as it shaped so many lives. The strength she wore, determined, brought truth to covered lies. Listen to my mentor, but hold your tears inside. Give thanks because she taught me to read between the lines. She started just a native girl who sat at elders' feet and learned from oral history of massacre and defeat. She was sent away to white man's school that stripped her native pride. She held her tongue, was made to feel her language was a crime. Though words were hidden deep for fear of being beat, she came back stronger than she left. She'd never claimed defeat. She held back tears and fears and proved she counted in this life. With education as her goal, she'd never stop her fight. She wrote the books that hold the truth, now written down in ink. The school that tried to steal her pride now her degree. Presidents, PhDs, though hard to make them hear, she spent her life to make things right. And then as her life drew near, this woman, dark with color, I think minority is the word. She is bravely seen and honored now, her heritage proudly heard. The stories that were passed down to me while sitting at her feet, she helped me read between the lines. a truth I could not flee. I sat high beside the willows, her dark eyes now free, reflecting from Bear River and looking back at me. I often say her spirit peers from beneath my mask of skin, and that through my memories, she gets to live again. In 1932, the good people of Franklin County had an idea. They wanted to erect a monument to remember the events of January 29th in 1863 and the role that the locals played in that event. It was a celebrated affair. The whole community came together to celebrate their achievements. Baby kissing politicians, local historians, church leaders, and others. Also included in that group was my relatives, sitting on the front row of the stage, dressed in full regalia, smiling and just probably happy to be there at a monument unveiling that would tell the visitors of what happened on that terrible morning. Also in the crowd that day would have been a shy 13-year-old girl named Mae Timbimboo. She was smart for her age and mature well beyond her years. As they took down the sheet and unveiled this monument that resembled a teepee, and I want to believe that as she read that plaque for the first time, that spoke of savage Indians and women and children combatants, I want to believe that it was at that precise moment in time that she became the woman that she was going to be for the rest of her life. She became an activist, a fierce advocate for her people. Her activism was on display again in 1989 when locals petitioned the National Park Service to designate that site as the Battle of Bear River and place it on the National Historic Registry. As one local historian, Allie Hansen, put it, "You people have only one account of what happened on that day. And we all know that oral history cannot be trusted." But my grandmother bit her lip and persevered. And after going to Washington, D.C. more than 10 times, in 1990, the National Park Service designated that area as the Bear River Massacre. For as long as I can remember, my Native American culture has been something that I was proud of, something that I wanted to share with the world. Those thoughts and feelings were written on my mind and witnessed in my soul daily by the hands and heart of a loving grandmother. I could talk for hours about her hands, those hands that were always so soft and despite years and years and years of beadwork and brain tanning. Those hands that would rub Vicks on my chest as a young boy if I had a cold. Those hands that spent many hours writing meticulously about her people, making sure that not one detail was left. Her hands that knew the meaning of hard work. Because as an Indigenous woman, a woman of color, she knew that her path was going to be harder. But hard work was deeply ingrained, like many of her habits and stories. As long ago as I can remember, there was always something different about her. She wasn't like the other grandmas, who always seemed so old to me. She was quiet and thoughtful, but you could tell she had an unbreakable spirit that beckoned me to her. In May of 1976, she was invited to speak at Idaho Days to celebrate the country's bicentennial celebration. She sent back a letter saying this: "It is with regret that I write this little note. I will be unable to be with you on this day, but my thoughts and spirit will be with the people celebrating the birth of this country. My plans were made more than a year ago to be with my people in Seattle in the great Northwest. May all of you have an enjoyable time. And I will be thinking about you and this country where my Northwestern Shoshone people were exterminated and humiliated beyond belief by your ancestors." That was my grandmother. I love the fact that my grandmother and I shared this special bond that was different from her other grandchildren. Looking back on it now, I believe that she knew that the journey that she was on to tell our story from our perspective was one day going to be mine. I can close my eyes and I can remember her black hair, easy yet strong. I remember how it shined just as she did. Her dark skin with deep creases told of a life lived hard, a life of giving, a life of loving, a life of caring. She was then and always will be my hero. She was my grandmother. She was a beautiful tribal elder who loved and served her people. As I was growing up, I only lived 3 miles away. I remember begging my parents to let me go stay with her, and so they did. I spent many hours at her house, at her side. That gave me a deep-seated understanding of what my journey was going to be. It was a journey that I would have never anticipated as a young boy. You see, she was our storyteller, a calling that would one day become mine. She was our tribal historian. This title was important to my native people because it was the job of the tribal historian to carry on the culture and traditions and a way of life, histories that have always been passed down from one generation to the next through story. She remains with me every day now, though her body does not. But although I think there's not one day that goes by that I don't feel her presence, sometimes when I'm at an elementary school speaking to the fourth graders about traditions and cultures, I feel her stories speak to me just like they did when I was in my youth. When I met a group of people at the Bear River Massacre site, like most people who may have been learning about it for the first time, a massacre of our people at the hands of the U.S. Army stationed at Camp Lugos, Utah. That massacre would become one of the largest massacres of Native Americans in the history of this country, especially west of the Mississippi. I felt her presence when I was negotiating for the purchase of that sacred burial site, that land where more than 400 Shoshones still lie today. There were many times when my spirit was low and I was disheartened, but the thought of disappointing her became overwhelming. But then I remember her never-ending drive to tell the story. Nothing would ever get in her way. Nothing would ever keep her from telling the story of our people. She traveled to Washington more than 10 times, advocating for her people. For many years, the locals and the Park Service referred to that place as the Battle of Bear River. Because of her lobbying efforts, the site was eventually changed to the Bear River Massacre. I remember going to her small little home, wooden home. It always seemed so old to me, like the stories that she shared. As I entered her home and walked around the corner into the small kitchen, she would always be sitting in the same spot at the end of the table. That was always comforting for me. It was something that as a young Shoshone boy, I could always count on. And there in front of her was a pile of brilliantly colored beads, beads that would soon be transformed into a beautiful necklace or a pair of hand-stitched moccasins. Our people are known for their beautiful beadwork. And the mountain rose, those patterns are easily recognized by the professional eye as work coming from the Shoshone people. The furniture in our home was always worn but neat and clean. The smell of smoked buckskin was always so comforting to me. I thought that every person's grandmother's home smelled that way. It wasn't until later in life that I learned that that wasn't the case. She used a buckskin to make gloves and moccasins and other items that she would often sell or just give away to complete strangers. Her mastered skills were so carefully displayed as each item was made and each bead was threaded for someone she loved. For centuries, her people practiced those skills out of necessity. They used those skills to make their clothing because it was their way of life. Going outside in the backyard as a child was an adventure. There was a shed, an orchard, a beautiful garden that anyone would want to call their own. My favorite part of the garden, though, is the rhubarb that my grandmother would grow. She would send me outside to collect rhubarb. She would cook it down and add a generous portion of sugar, and then make it into a pie or pudding. But I liked it fresh, just off the stalk. It reminded me of celery. But when I took a bite, it always made my mouth pucker like it is right now. My mouth still waters every time I think about that. Many times as I played outside by the shed, I would find deer hides and animal skins in various stages of brain tanning, because that's how her people had done it. Brain tanning allows a softer skin. After scraping all of the hair off the animal, she would rub the brains on both sides of the hide to make it soft. That was a skill she learned as a young girl that had been practiced by her ancestors for thousands of years. As I've gotten older, I think about everything that she taught me, the importance of never letting it be forgotten. I wish I'd been more attentive to what she was trying to teach me in those days. I wish I could go back because I would do it differently. With age comes wisdom. That I know. I wish it was easier for our children to understand that principle today. Last month, I participated in a sweat lodge and listened to the elder who conducted the sweat lodge and ceremony talk about the importance of family and learning from our elders. He said they are our most prized possession. My grandmother always had a homemade pot of stew on the stove and fresh bread nearby. When I close my eyes, I can still smell it. As a child, I often wondered why it was there every day. And I finally got up the courage to ask her, "Grandma, why do you have a pot of stew on the stove every day?" It was then she taught me a beautiful lesson. It was a lesson that had been taught to her by her parents. And it was a lesson that had been shared for many generations. She said, "Darren, in our culture, You never have someone in your home without feeding them. But I said, Grandma, what if they're not hungry? She told me that they were probably being polite and you feed them anyway. You see, my grandmother's people for hundreds of years were never more than a day away from starvation. So that made sense. They were hunters and gatherers. As a young girl, while most of the families had moved to Washakie and had very little food and often went without, my grandmother's family was different. They knew the meaning of hard work and how to save for tough times. The Timbimboo family was well known for their gardens. They canned almost everything they could get their hands on. They had fruit trees and raised chickens. My grandmother's family often provided food to other families in need. But the concept of sharing a meal or sharing what you had with a stranger was still deeply ingrained. For thousands of years, our people had all things in common. We had no concept of personal property. So sharing the responsibility for and taking care of our neighbors was still part of life. This helped me understand why there was always a pot of stew on the stove. My grandmother would tell me that our communities are only as strong as the most vulnerable within our community. It was our responsibility to take care of the marginalized and the weak, those who appear to be a little different, those who love differently, or maybe even worship differently. It seemed like every day, at different times, there would come a knock at the door. As she opened it and let the strangers in, they would always say the same thing. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me and sharing the history of your people. They were mostly graduate students who were working on their advanced degrees, but who also shared a deep love and commitment for sharing a history of a people whose voice had seldom been heard. Sometimes they were journalists looking for the perfect story, or sometimes they were just ordinary people who had heard about the massacre and were touched in some way. It was here in her home as a curious boy that I met some wonderful people who, like her, had a deep love for history. Historians like Brigham Madsen, a professor at the University of Utah, Scott Christensen, an archivist for the LDS Church who wrote a book about Chief Sagwitch, my third great-grandfather. Allie Hansen, though our paths may not have started out really well in the early days, she became a wonderful dear friend to my grandmother. Those are just to name a few. Those individuals who meant nothing to me as a young boy, but oh, how I would love to go back and learn from them today. They are giants to me now, just like my grandmother was then. My grandmother understood something. She understood that they could help her tell this story that had never been told. You could say that those legends of history owe a great deal of success because of the information that my grandmother provided them. But I think they needed each other, in a sense, to further both of their causes. It has taken me 52 years to realize what an important role my grandmother played in sharing this history and culture. She impacted the way that history was recorded, and she set the record straight when it came to Native American history. But it was also important to her that everyone's point of view was heard and respected. She would always say, everyone has a story worthy of being told. What is your story going to be? Because your story is equally as important as mine. Although I didn't know it at the time, my grandmother was kind of important. You see, she'd been our tribal historian, keeper of the oral history. She'd been to Washington, D.C. more times than I could count. There she met with senators and representatives and other government officials who would listen to her stories. She knew that for hundreds of years, no one would ever listen. She served as a representative on the White House Council for Indian Tribal Affairs. This was a position that allowed her and other Native American leaders to coordinate all of the federal programs and resources the government had to help tribes. She was also instrumental in helping the state of Utah develop their Native American Graves Protection and Reparation Act. This program made it possible for and mandatory that government agencies and municipalities return Native American artifacts to the indigenous tribes that they belong to, including human remains. Before this program, artifacts and human remains were never returned to the people they belonged to. I remember being in her home one day as a young father. She received a phone call. She was just talking matter-of-factly with the person on the other end. When she hung up, I asked her who it was, and she said it was President Bill Clinton, that he was in Salt Lake just leaving the LDS Church's tall and spacious building. And he was flying out that afternoon, but he was wondering if she would have time to come meet him at the executive airport before he left. Who knew? In 1986, she was awarded what I think to her was one of the greatest awards she could have been given. She was named Utah's Mother of the Year. Not only was she the mother to her children and grandchildren, but she was the mother to her tribal family. She was a tribe's matriarch, instilling in us a love of God, a love of education, and a love for her people. There were certain times of each day as I visited that she would call me to sit at her feet, just as she had done with her grandparents, and listen to the stories. For thousands of years, tribal elders would sit down with the children and tell them stories. Stories were always the same. There was never a word out of place because it had to be that way. It had to be accurate. Our children needed to hear the stories as the elders had heard the stories, because in an oral history culture, it had to be that way. If I ever looked tired or distracted, she would quit. It was important for her that I understood every detail. That was the only way that I was going to be able to memorize those important details that had been passed down for generations. Have you ever had a memory sneak out of your eye and roll down your cheek? I have that all the time when I think about the stories that she shared. My grandmother was an educated woman. She was the product of the boarding school systems in the 1920s. The system was designed to assimilate Native American children into Euro-American culture. The creed and motto was kill the Indian to save the man. If she spoke her language or referred to her people in any way, she was punished. This would ensure that the children returned home and continued that assimilation process. But my grandmother didn't do that. She returned home and continued her education at Bear River High School and then LDS Business College, where she earned her degree in English. But that educational process wasn't always easy. One day, she was attending the Washakie Day School. Her teacher made her stand on a chair in front of the other children. And he said, "Mae, you're going to turn out to be like the rest of these children, sitting in dirt and being useless for the rest of your life." I want to believe that that experience gave her an even greater incentive to succeed, and not only in school, but in life. While in high school, she did something that literally has changed the Northwestern Band of Shoshone's culture. She began writing down all of the stories that she'd heard from her grandfather, Dabuzi, who later took the name of Jaeger after his baptism into the Mormon Church. Jaeger was 12 years old during the massacre. There's an old saying that I love that says, when an old Indian dies, the library burns. And that was never as true as it was about her. Because of her, I developed this great love for history. I began to remember the stories that my grandmother told me about how the coyote stole fire or how the bald eagle became bald. So I was eager to learn more about our people. It didn't take me long to realize that none of the stories that my grandmother told me were in our history books. That was confusing to me. I'd always believed that historical events were an absolute. I believed that events that transpired over time had one conclusion. But as I've gotten older, I've figured out that history is about perspective. Whose perspective? And then one day I read a quote attributed to Winston Churchill, and he said that history is only written by the victors. I guess that perfectly explains why Native American histories are not written and not told. But I would like to change that. Our voices need to be heard. It's not because we as Native Americans are looking to have things made right. We're not. But I believe that those who died at Bear River have a God-given right to be heard. Their voices speak to me from the dust. You know, our history books today are full of stories written from one perspective. If we take what we read and believe it at face value, I found that we only get half the story. And half the story isn't the full story. It might not even be the most entertaining or part of the story. This has always made me look at things differently. I find myself questioning what a different perspective would look like. And I hope it will do the same for you. I need to tell you about an experience I had at the Daughters of Utah Pioneers Monument just a few months ago. I met a group of fourth graders there. Just north in the same parking lot is a tree. We call it the honor tree. People will leave trinkets and things, dream catchers, ribbons, teddy bears. They leave those for their own reason, to honor those people who died that day. I was there with 70 fourth graders. As we were all looking at this tree, one of the boys in the class said, "I see a mirror hanging in the tree. Why do you think there'd be a mirror hanging in this tree?" I frantically tried to come up with some clever answer, but I was stumped. I had no idea. And then the smallest girl in the class standing next to me bailed me out, thank goodness. She said, "I know why there's a mirror hanging in that tree." She said, "That mirror is there to remind us that we did this. And that if we don't learn from history, we can do it again." Right there at that moment with that little fourth grader, I had a flashback to what that little fourth grader is going to be. She's going to be like my grandma. You know, ours is a perspective that has never been written down and never heard. It's important for me and her to view our culture and our history with our own eyes. I think our story is one of faith It's a story about forgiveness. It's a story about a group of people who overcome great tragedy and loss. The massacre at Ogoi was the largest massacre of Native Americans perpetrated by the U.S. Army. The ramifications were many. It changed how the U.S. Army dealt with other Native tribes in the future. And it also altered the lives of a small band of people who only wanted to be left alone. All of these things, though, bring me back to a grandmother. I wish everyone could have known her. She always spoke from her heart and spoke the truth, whether it was to a group of fourth graders or to President Clinton. I've learned over the years that people will always forget facts and figures about history, but they will never forget how they felt when they hear a story. That was the difference. That's what made my grandmother different. She was a storyteller. She was an icon to her people, but she was a treasure to me. Even after she was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, she led and taught and loved with the same passion she'd always had. I cherish those memories sitting at her old kitchen table with the TV always on in the background. Her shaking, the effects of Parkinson's disease, made it impossible for her to stitch those moccasins and gloves like she used to, so that job became mine. But her mind was always sharp. She never did quit teaching lessons of life to her now grown grandson who had kids of his own. I'm grateful that my children had the opportunity to meet her. They called her Purple Grandma because they said when they were little, her lips looked so purple against her dark skin. I wonder what my grandmother would think about where we are today. It was important for her that our story be told from our perspective. I think she'd probably be a little embarrassed by all the attention and the awards that she's received over the last few years. But because of her and the stories that she told, we now have the opportunity to share them with the world. My grandmother would only dream of once again owning that land where her people called home. But that dream is now a reality with the purchase of that massacre site. That sacred site and land will be preserved forever. How ironic that we've had to purchase that land back from land that we had long ago in the name of civilization. I wish that I could go back and have one more day with her. I'd listen more intently. I'd suck up all the knowledge that I could. I'd write things down and commit them to memory. During her long and incredible life, my grandmother fought tirelessly for Northwestern tribal sovereignty and recognition. Her notes on Shoshone botany have helped us restore the massacre site and contemporary understandings of Shoshone foodways that we're now bringing back. She always played a significant role in the public's narrative about the Bear River Massacre and the public's perception of that event. She would make sure that you knew her Shoshone people were not desperate victims of violence, but rather Native Americans who adapted from a great tragedy and who have survived on their own terms. She would want you to know that we're still here. My grandmother's influence didn't end with her passing in 2007. Her oldest son, Bruce, my father, served as the director of Indian Affairs for the state of Utah for more than 15 years. He later served on our tribal council and as chairman for a number of years. I am Mae's oldest grandson, and I served as chairman for a number of years until I ran for Congress. In 2017, I personally negotiated the purchase of that 550 acres of the Sacred Massacre site. And I want you to know I felt her influence and presence many times as I negotiated that deal. Mae's work lives on through her descendants. And I'm proudly to announce that all of her work will be found now in the archive and special collections at Utah State University and will be available for all. Jennifer, I'm grateful for state history, and Catherine for all the work that's been done by you and others, your team, to highlight strong women, to highlight and make Women's History Month so important, to give a voice to women who seldom ever had a voice. It's been an honor to be a part of something so special, and finally to see recognition come to a woman who I dearly loved and cherished. Grateful for every one of you and for what you do. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. And if you have questions, I'll take them.
Thank you, Darren. That was a really moving tribute to your grandmother. And I think we all felt the power of her story and her legacy and her influence. We have some just comments in the chat talking about thanking you for this beautiful tribute and talking about how we wish we'd had more opportunities to learn about this history and especially the stories that Mae told. While we're waiting for some questions, I'll ask you one. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the monument at the massacre site, about the changes that have happened in recent years, what you think your grandmother would have thought about that.
Yeah, a couple of different things. Every year we have a commemoration, and we always held it at that DUP monument, which was kind of problematic, and because every year people would come, and I think one of the last years we had it there, 400 to 500 came, but they would read the plaques on the monument and just get pretty ticked off about it. And they would call the national chapter of the Daughters of Utah Pioneers and tell them how horrific their monument was. And so a couple of years ago, 2019, they called me and said, we really need to do something about the plaque. And I suggested we come up with a new plaque and put it on there. I wasn't necessarily to take one down. I thought, I don't want to erase a perspective of people that lived that long ago, even though I didn't agree with any of it. But I said, let's put up another plaque on it that accurately reflects what happened that day. And so they did. They asked me what it should say. I told them. I sent in what I would put on the plaque. They took about one sentence of what I said and included that. But it was an important part. And I think the first part of the second plaque that's on there now says, here in this vicinity, more than 400 Shoshone men, women, and children were massacred by the U.S. Army. And so that to me was good enough. Right across the street, we're going to be building a 8,000 square foot interpretive center as soon as I get the rest of the funding for that. We've received all of the funding we need to restore the land to what it looked like in 1863, using my grandmother's plant diary as a guide. We have started land restoration efforts with the help of many partners, but especially Utah State University and their College of Natural Resources. We've been blessed by their science and their knowledge, and we continue to work together. This spring, we'll start a trail system. We'll be replanting 250,000 cottonwoods and willows. We'll be cleaning up a watershed, introducing beaver into the ecosystem, cleaning it up to the point that we can reintroduce the Bonneville cutthroat trout in the fishery. So a lot of work is being done on the site that looks completely different today than it did a year ago. We've removed more than half of the Russian olives that are there. And so the restoration work continues to move on and move forward. We will be building the amphitheater this summer as well. So there will be things to see on the trail systems and things. The building will come when I finish raising that money. So, and before building costs, I was almost there before they went up, but now it's increased by about another 2.5 million. So I've got a little bit of work to do, but we want to tell the story of not only the people, but we want to tell the story of the land. And it's equally as important because my grandmother always referred to our plants and animals and water as our kinfolk, which tells me that my relationship to nature, to the environment, is equal to my relationship with my human relatives. So we're doing it all, hopefully.
That's fantastic. And I can imagine that Mae would have been really proud to see that her work has been referenced and is being used there. We do have a question that came into the chat about recent bills that passed in this past legislature, specifically one called Individual Freedom in Public Education. And I know that you are a busy person and maybe not down in the weeds on every education bill, but they're wondering about your perspective on the types of things that we're seeing coming in legislation lately and the types of education and materials and curriculum that you would hope to see in the classroom.
I'm not really, I don't know the specifics of that bill. I spent about 10 days down there, but mostly tracking Native American other issues as it comes to our children and being adopted and things like that. I'm hypersensitive though to making sure our education stays, well, how can I put this? Just so we can still talk about and teach hard things. I don't want to get to a place that makes it impossible to not learn about our past and take hard things and teach it in a way. Look, the Bear River Massacre was horrific and terrible, but I use it in a way to teach and to inform. And as that little fourth grade girl said, that mirror is there to remind us that we did this and we could actually do it again if we don't learn from it. And so how do you learn from hard things? You learn from them by talking about them. So to me, it's a no-brainer that we make sure our education system is able and teachers can talk about hard things, hard history. We celebrate individual freedoms in this country like it's the greatest thing in the world. We honor our Pledge of Allegiance, liberty and justice for all. Well, I'm still patiently waiting for that part to happen. I mean, we don't have liberty and justice for all today, but I think we're making great strides in getting there. And I just hope our legislators are open to allowing education to take place, even the hard things, even the things that we're not proud of. And so we can learn from it so we don't repeat them.
Thank you, Darren, for that perspective. I have another question that I really wanted to ask, so I'll just throw that in here while we're waiting to see if other folks put things in the chat. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the challenges Mae faced in sharing this history from the Shoshone perspective. And I know, you've mentioned you were a boy when she was doing this work, but, from the things that you know now about the way that historical narratives are created, we know that changing those accepted narratives and adding perspectives to the story can sometimes be difficult when those voices haven't been heard or aren't respected. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about Mae's perseverance or the things that she did to make space for those stories and to have them be heard.
Well, that experience she had with Allie Hansen, I just found some of those meeting minutes when Franklin County got together to petition the National Park Service. So I grew up knowing Allie Hansen as a wonderful friend of my grandmother, just great friends. And that's how they've been their whole life. But when I found these meeting minutes and made a couple of phone calls to Allie's still alive in Preston today. And so I didn't call her, because her health is not that good, and I didn't want to be responsible for tipping her over. I called her children and said, so I just read this statement from your mother that said, it's kind of calling my grandmother out for oral history. And you people, that's how she referred to Mae and our people. You can't rely on oral history, and you only have one person's account of what happened that day. That is completely different than what I grew up knowing about my Mae and Allie Hansen. And her kids laughed about that, and they said, yeah, it didn't start out very well at all. But she said, your grandmother was very patient. And because I think she had to be. I think in the space that she lived and in the world that she lived in, if she got angry and just bitter every time, and she may have, but she, I think, created a space that she could forgive and just know that that was part of culture, and not good parts of culture, but it was her lived perspective after going to boarding school and other things and going through what she'd gone through. I think she knew that this was going to be the long game, and that she might not be able to accomplish everything she wanted to, but that's why I think she made really sure that she spent a lot of time with me and told me point blank, no one has ever wanted to hear our story before. One day you will have to make them listen. And you know what? I think because of her work and just over time and other activists that have been pushing the bar and pushing the needle, I really haven't had to make anybody listen. I think we live in a time, and especially now being at the University of Utah and Utah State, this generation that we have now, I think they want to know. I think they honor truth telling, and they want to know. And it's okay, but don't try to hide things, and don't not answer questions that they have because they want to know. And I'm happy that this generation is where we're at today. I feel heartened and uplifted every time I go to a class and hear their perspective and them wanting to be transparent with all of history, the good and the bad. And I think she was just born for that time and era to show this little bit of patience, even though there were sides of her where I could tell she had to get that little dig in when they invited her to speak at the bicentennial. That was probably her way of therapy, to get a little bit of a release. And I feel that sometimes. There's times I go home from a meeting to even today thinking, oh my gosh, I can finally cuss in my car with nobody around and they won't see that side of me. But I'm grateful that for her patience, really, in a time that called for it. And so I'm grateful to carry that torch for her.
Thank you for sharing that. Another question that I have, based on some of the things you said earlier, you talked about the story that Mae hoped people would learn about her people. I'm wondering what you think they would want us, or sorry, she would want us to learn from her life. If we're talking about her story now.
I think she'd want us to know that, and she always talked about this, that bad things happen to people, hard things. We go through hard things in life, which always told me that her life probably wasn't very easy. One of the reasons she went to boarding school is because she was raised at Washakie, that little church farm just north of Tremont in Utah. There wasn't one blade of grass there. It was sagebrush and rattlesnakes and everything else. And, the government didn't steal her and take her to boarding school. They did that to her sisters, but when she went with her parents to drop off her sisters at boarding school in California, she asked her parents if she could stay because there was grass and trees and flowers, and it was at the Sherman Institute in Riverside, California, and she begged to stay at boarding school. And I'm thinking, she probably really didn't realize what she was getting herself into, first of all. But she had seen beauty and smelled beauty and saw something that she had never known her whole life. And so I think that to her was a way to escape what was probably pretty hard as a woman of color and indigenous. And I just think it was a tough time. But that boarding school experience, I know, kind of changed who she was. And really, she decided when she was there that I'm going to use this opportunity to get smart, get educated, so I can survive when I get out, and use education as the way to survive, use it as a bullet, use it as a weapon. And I think that's what she did, and she was very successful in doing that. But yeah, it wasn't very easy for her, for sure. And the hardships she must have gone through are still probably pretty prevalent for that time and date. So
I love what you've shared about how she uses the opportunities that she has. I'm speaking about her in present tense here, but how.
Yeah, and I think that's an important lesson for all of us. We're all going to go through hard things. I mean, I would have never dreamed that 3 years ago I would go survive cancer and open heart surgery all in 1 year and still be here. And just so grateful for life. But I just think she wants us to learn from those hard things and keep persevering and keep telling the story, and good things will happen and things will turn out the way they should.
Thank you for that perspective. We have many messages in the chat thanking you for sharing your grandmother's story. Some Eileen Quintana saying, thank you, Darren, for sharing about your grandmother. I loved her as well. And many other messages with that sentiment. So I know that we've all been touched hearing her story and thinking about the work that she did and why that matters and how we can learn from that today. So we really appreciate you spending this time with us, Darren, and sharing that perspective into Mae's life. Is there anything that you'd like to share with us as we close things out?
No, I'm just grateful for strong women in my life. More than anything else, I've been blessed, and I am the person I am today because of strong women in my life. I have 3 daughters that I have raised to be strong women. And so I celebrate you this month, all of you. I see many friends on here that I recognize their names. I'm grateful that you join us today and just give me a chance to talk about a strong woman in my life. So keep doing what you do because it makes a difference. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Darren. Again, we're very honored to have you share this story and for you to share your time with us today in a busy season, especially for you. We appreciate you joining us, and we hope that you'll tune in for other speaker series events with the Utah Division of State History, where we're committed to learning from the past and building on our shared future together. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.